The radar screen flickered at 3:47 hours, and the night shift controller at Edwards Air Force Base squinted at something that shouldn't exist. A commercial airliner, Delta Flight 2749, had just vanished from controlled airspace over the Mojave Desert. Not gradually, not with warning. It simply disappeared from every screen simultaneously, as if someone had reached into the sky and plucked it from existence. The controller's coffee went cold in his hand as he reached for the red phone, but before his fingers touched it, the blip reappeared. Same altitude, same heading, exactly 4 seconds later. The FAA would later classify those 4 seconds as unexplained. The Pentagon would classify them as impossible. But in the cockpit of that Boeing 777, Captain Rivka Anthem Murrin had just made a decision that would turn her from a footnote in military history into a legend whispered about in ready rooms across 3 continents. Rivka hadn't flown combat missions in 7 years. She'd left the Air Force as a decorated A-10 Warthog pilot with 2 distinguished flying crosses and a medical discharge that came with sympathetic looks and a handshake from a 2-star general who couldn't meet her eyes. Nerve damage in her left hand, they said. Intermittent tremors from a close-range ejection over Kandahar. Fit for commercial aviation, the doctors concluded, but not for the precision violence of modern air combat. She'd accepted it the way you accept a scar, folded it into who she was, and moved on. Now she flew passengers from LAX to JFK, explaining turbulence to nervous travelers and making small talk with flight attendants named Marcus and Jin. Her uniform was pressed, her logbook was spotless, and nobody asked about the call sign embroidered in faded thread on the flight bag she still carried from her squadron days. Tonight she'd been thinking about her daughter's birthday, planning the words she'd say over video call from a hotel room in New York. She'd been monitoring weather patterns and mentally calculating fuel reserves and doing all the invisible work that keeps aluminum tubes full of sleeping people safe at 39,000 feet. Then the instruments started lying. Altimeter spinning. Airspeed indicator frozen. GPS coordinates placing them over the Pacific Ocean, which was physically impossible given their westbound departure 7 minutes prior. Her co-pilot, a former Navy pilot named Cale Torrens, looked at her with the kind of fear that comes from understanding exactly how wrong things had gone. Marcus settled into his jump seat behind them and kept his voice steady. "Captain, the passengers felt something. Quick drop. They're asking questions." Rivka's left hand trembled against the yoke, that familiar phantom pain from shattered nerves, but her right hand moved to the radio with muscle memory from another life entirely. She'd been a warrior once, before the discharge, before the airline uniform, before the quiet resignation to being forgotten. The Air Force had called her Anthem because she'd flown into gunfire singing Patsy Cline over open comms, keeping her voice steady so her wingmen would know she wasn't afraid. They'd mocked it at first, thought it was bravado, until the day she'd taken 14 hits from ground fire and still brought her aircraft home with 3 wounded soldiers in the backseat. After that, Anthem meant something different. It meant someone who wouldn't break, no matter what the sky threw at them. But that was years ago, and tonight she was just Captain Murrin, flying a route she'd flown 200 times before. Except the instruments were still lying, and now the backup systems were going dark one by one, and through the cockpit window she could see something that made her blood crystallize into ice. Lights. Formation lights. Military aircraft, 4 of them, matching her altitude and speed in perfect symmetry, close enough that she could see the moonlight reflecting off their canopies. She recognized the silhouette immediately from briefings she'd attended in another lifetime. F-22 Raptors, the most advanced air superiority fighters in American inventory, and they were treating her civilian airliner like a potential threat, which meant someone somewhere had given an order that would end with her name on a classified report and 189 passengers as collateral damage to national security. Cale's breathing had gone shallow. Why would they scramble fighters on us? We're squawking 7700. We're clearly in distress. Rivka didn't answer because she was already calculating angles and distances, running through scenarios with the part of her brain that had never stopped being a combat pilot. The F-22s hadn't established radio contact. That was wrong. Protocol demanded they attempt communication before aggressive positioning, but these four aircraft were flying tactical intercept formation, and the lead pilot was drifting closer, near enough that she could see his helmet turn toward her cockpit. Then her radio crackled with a voice that carried the flat authority of someone used to being obeyed without question. Unidentified aircraft, this is Viper 11. You are off course and non-responsive to ATC directives. Acknowledge immediately or we will interpret your actions as hostile. Unidentified aircraft. They didn't recognize her transponder. Whatever had killed her instruments had also made her invisible to everyone who mattered, turned her into a ghost plane flying dark over American soil. And ghost planes, especially big ones that deviated from course, got one warning before they got shot down. The post-9/11 protocols were absolute, and she'd helped write some of them back when she'd been stationed at Langley doing operational planning. She knew exactly how this ended, and it wasn't with negotiation. Her hand moved to the transmit button. Viper 11, this is Delta 2749, heavy, experiencing complete avionics failure. We are not hostile. Repeat, we are a civilian airliner in distress with full passenger load. Her voice carried the calm that came from too many missions where calm was the only thing standing between survival and catastrophe. Silence. 5 seconds that felt like drowning. Then the response came, clipped and procedural. Delta 2749, we have no record of your flight plan. You are currently violating restricted airspace. Acknowledge and prepare to follow escort instructions. Restricted airspace. That was impossible. Their route was nowhere near military operations areas. But then the GPS was showing them over the ocean, and the instruments thought they were flying upside down, and none of it made sense except for the sick certainty that something had hijacked her aircraft's electronics and was steering them toward a scenario that ended with interceptor missiles. Rivka looked at Kale. Get on the satellite phone, call dispatch, tell them we need to verify our actual position using ground references, and tell them we've got fighter escort treating us like a threat. Kale's hands were shaking as he reached for the sat phone, but they steadied when he started dialing. He'd been a prowler pilot, electronic warfare, and he understood what it meant when your instruments betrayed you at the worst possible moment. Behind them, Marcus spoke quietly. Captain, should I tell the passengers something? Tell them we're experiencing technical difficulties and being escorted by military aircraft as a precaution. Keep it calm. No details about the intercept. Rivka watched the F-22s adjust their formation, tightening the box, leaving no room for deviation. She could see the weapon's pylons now, missiles waiting in the moonlight. Her left hand tremored against the yoke, and for just a moment she let herself feel the weight of what was happening. 189 people who'd fallen asleep trusting her to keep them safe. Children in window seats dreaming about Disneyland. Business travelers with meetings in the morning. A teenage girl, same age as her daughter, traveling alone to visit her dad. And 4 pilots in fighter jets waiting for an order to end all of those futures, because some electronic glitch had turned her into a threat to national security. But Rivka Murrin hadn't survived 3 tour and 87 combat missions by surrendering to fear. She'd survived by thinking faster, flying better, and refusing to accept that any situation was hopeless. Her call sign hadn't been Anthem because she sang. It had been Anthem because she made others believe they could win even when the odds were mathematically impossible. She keyed the radio again, but this time she didn't use her airline voice. She used the voice from before, from the desert and the gunfire and the missions where every word mattered. Viper 11, this is Anthem. She let that call sign hang in the air between them, let it register with whoever was listening. Every military pilot knew the famous call signs, the ones that got passed down through squadron histories. Anthem was one of them. I need you to verify my actual GPS coordinates using your systems. My instruments are compromised. I've got 189 souls on board and I'm flying on basic trim and compass heading. The silence lasted longer this time. She could imagine the conversation happening on the other frequency, the lead pilot checking databases, confirming identities, recognizing a name from after-action reports. Then the voice came back, and it was different now, less mechanical, carrying recognition. Anthem Viper 1-1, copy your situation, stand by for coordinate verification. A pause, then quieter, almost human. Good to have you back in the air, ma'am. Something loosened in Rivka's chest just slightly, but the F-22s were still there, and the instruments were still dead, and they were still flying blind over terrain she couldn't identify. The recognition bought her time, nothing more. Cale looked up from the sat phone. Dispatch confirms we should be over western Arizona, approaching the California border. They're seeing our transponder intermittently. They think we're experiencing some kind of electronic attack. Electronic attack. That changed everything. That meant this wasn't mechanical failure or bad luck. Someone or something was actively targeting her aircraft, jamming their systems, making them invisible to friendly forces while pushing them toward restricted airspace. And if it was deliberate, then whoever was behind it knew exactly what would happen when an unidentified heavy aircraft violated military airspace at night. They were trying to make the Air Force shoot down a civilian airliner. She felt the old combat instincts kick in, the cold tactical clarity that had kept her alive when missiles were tracking her through the mountains. Viper 1-1, Anthem. I believe we're experiencing active electronic warfare. Request you maintain escort and help me navigate to nearest suitable airport using ground references. Anthem Viper 1-1. Roger that. We're seeing anomalous signals in this area, adjusting formation to defensive posture. Recommend immediate descent to 15,000 to minimize exposure. We'll guide you to Edwards. Edwards, the base where this nightmare had started, where some controller was probably still staring at his radar screen trying to understand what he was seeing. But Edwards had long runways and emergency equipment, and people who knew how to handle aircraft that came home broken. If she could get there, she could land this plane safely, get her passengers on the ground, and figure out what the hell had just happened. Viper 1-1 Anthem. Beginning descent to flight level 150, requesting vector. The F-22s shifted formation, spreading out, giving her room to maneuver while maintaining protective positioning. The lead aircraft, Viper 1-1, moved alongside her left wing, close enough that she could see the pilot's hand signals through the darkness. Turn right. Descend. Follow. Basic visual communication from the early days of aviation, when pilots had nothing but hand gestures and courage. Rivka eased the yoke forward, beginning a gentle descent, feeling the aircraft respond sluggishly without the help of the autopilot. The 777 was designed to be flown by computers, but tonight it was being flown by hands and instinct, and her left hand was still trembling but her right was rock steady on the throttles. Marcus, she called over her shoulder, tell the passengers we're beginning our descent and we'll be landing shortly. Keep it normal, keep it boring. She heard him move back into the cabin, heard his voice over the PA system smooth as silk, making it sound like nothing more than a routine approach. That's what good flight attendants did. They made the impossible seem ordinary. Cale was reading off the backup instruments, the few that still worked, calling out altitude and airspeed while monitoring the fuel gauges. 11,000 pounds remaining. We've got about 90 minutes of flying time if we stay at efficient cruise, plenty to reach Edwards. But 90 minutes was an eternity when someone was actively trying to kill your aircraft. The electronic attack hadn't stopped. The instruments were still showing impossible readings, and now the radio was starting to crackle with interference, making communication difficult. Whoever was doing this had sophisticated equipment and a deep understanding of how to disrupt modern avionics. Military grade, Rivka thought, or someone who'd learned from military sources. Through the cockpit window, she could see lights below now. Small towns scattered across the desert, highways cutting through darkness, the ambient glow of civilization. She used them to orient herself, matching patterns to the mental maps she'd built over years of flying this route. That cluster, there might be needles. The straight line of light to the south was probably Interstate 40. She was navigating like pilots had before GPS, before computers, using nothing but eyes and memory and the fundamental geometry of Earth and sky. Viper 11's voice cut through the static. Anthem, be advised, we're picking up increased jamming activity. Someone is actively trying to deny you communication and navigation. Recommend you follow visual guidance only. We'll be your eyes. Rivka acknowledged, then looked at Kale. If this is a coordinated attack, they might try to prevent us from landing. We need to be ready for anything. He nodded, his face pale but determined in the instrument glow. You thinking what I'm thinking? That someone wants this plane to crash or get shot down, and they're willing to go to considerable effort to make it happen. Yeah, I'm thinking that. The implications were staggering. Electronic warfare equipment capable of disrupting commercial avionics wasn't something you bought at Radio Shack. This required resources, planning, expertise. It required someone with access to military technology and knowledge of air defense protocols. And it required a motive cold enough to murder 189 innocent people to achieve some larger goal. But Rivka pushed those thoughts aside because philosophy wouldn't land this aircraft. She needed to focus on the immediate problem, getting from here to Edwards with no instruments, limited communication, and an unknown adversary actively working against her. The F-22s were helping, but they couldn't fly her plane. That was on her and her alone. The descent continued, the altimeter slowly unwinding through 15,000 feet while the desert drew closer below. She could see more detail now, the texture of the landscape, the way roads bent around geological features. Her combat training had included low-level navigation, flying the A-10 at 500 feet through hostile territory using nothing but terrain features and a compass. This was higher, but the principle was the same. Trust your eyes, trust your instincts, and never stop moving forward. Viper 11 called out a course correction. Anthem, recommend heading 270. Edwards is approximately 40 miles west. You're cleared straight into runway 22. All other traffic has been diverted. 40 miles. 10 minutes, maybe 12. She could do this. She'd done harder things with worse odds. But then the cockpit lights flickered, and for a heart-stopping moment every screen went black. Total electrical failure. The kind of catastrophic system loss that shouldn't be possible in a modern aircraft with triple redundancy. When the lights came back 3 seconds later, she knew with absolute certainty that whoever was attacking them wasn't going to stop until she was on the ground or in flames. Kale, I need you to start pulling circuit breakers for anything non-essential. Strip this bird down to the absolute minimum. If they're hitting us with some kind of directed energy, I want less systems for them to target. His hands moved fast, pulling breakers in sequence, killing cabin entertainment systems, Wi-Fi, climate control, anything that drew power and didn't contribute to flying. The cockpit grew quieter as systems shut down, leaving only the essential hum of engines and the whisper of wind over the fuselage. Viper 11 had closed formation again, the F-22 so close she could see the pilot's helmet moving as he scanned for threats. A second fighter moved to her right wing, matching her speed exactly, while the other two maintained high cover. They were flying combat patrol over American soil, protecting a commercial airliner from an invisible enemy, and the surreal wrongness of it all was almost overwhelming. But Rivka had learned long ago not to waste energy on disbelief. Accept reality, adapt to it, overcome it. That was the fighter pilot's creed, and it worked just as well in a 777 as it had in a Warthog. She keyed the radio one more time. Viper 11 Anthem, thank you for the escort. You're keeping us alive up here. The response was immediate and fierce. "Anthem, you kept enough of us alive downrange. We're just returning the favor. Focus on flying. We've got your six." Those words meant more than the pilot probably realized. "We've got your six." Fighter pilot shorthand for "I'm watching your back. I won't let anyone hurt you. You're not alone." She'd said those same words to countless wingmen over hostile territory, and now someone was saying them to her when she needed them most. The miles fell away beneath them, and Edwards grew closer. She could see the runway lights now, a perfect line of brilliance cutting through the darkness. Almost home, almost safe. But the jamming was getting worse, the interference building like static electricity before a storm, and she knew with grim certainty that whoever was behind this would make their final move soon. They'd invested too much to let her land safely. They'd try something desperate, something final, and she'd have to be ready. Her left hand was shaking badly now, the nerve damage aggravated by stress and adrenaline, but she gripped the yoke tighter and refused to let it matter. Pain was just information. Fear was just chemistry. Neither one could stop her from doing her job. Cale counted down the distance. 30 miles, descending through 12,000, fuel holding steady. The F-22s adjusted formation as she descended, maintaining their protective box while giving her room to maneuver. Professional, precise, perfect. She remembered flying like that, the choreography of formation flight, the unspoken communication between pilots who trusted each other absolutely. It was beautiful even now, even in crisis, the way the aircraft moved together through three-dimensional space as if connected by invisible threads. "Anthem, Viper 1-1. Edwards Tower reports they're ready for you. Emergency vehicles standing by. You're cleared for visual approach runway 22, winds light and variable." Visual approach. No ILS guidance, no computers to help her find the glide path. Just her eyes and her experience and the fundamental physics of getting 200 tons of aluminum and humanity down from the sky and onto solid ground without killing anyone. She'd trained for this scenario 1,000 times in simulators, but simulators didn't include active jamming or fighter escorts or the knowledge that people had died because of failures that were less dramatic than what she was experiencing right now. But she'd also trained for this in combat, where there were no second chances and no reset buttons, where every decision had weight measured in lives. And she was still here, still flying, still fighting. Viper 1-1 Anthem, roger that, beginning final approach. She banked left, lining up with the runway that was still 15 miles away, starting the long, slow descent that would end either on the ground or in catastrophe. The instruments flickered again, longer this time, and when they came back the airspeed indicator was frozen at 340 knots, which was impossible given her power setting and descent rate. Flying blind. Flying on instinct and muscle memory and the kind of skill that could only be earned through years of practice and pressure. The desert rushed up to meet them, and Rivka Murrin flew her broken aircraft towards salvation, while 4 fighters held formation in the darkness, and 189 passengers slept or prayed or clutched armrests, without understanding how close they were to the edge of everything. The next 10 minutes would determine whether she became a hero or a statistic, whether her daughter would grow up remembering her mother or mourning her, whether the call sign Anthem would be remembered as something glorious or something tragic. She pushed the thoughts away and focused on the runway lights growing larger, the geometry of the approach, the tiny corrections needed to keep them on path. Her hands moved across the controls with economy and precision, and for just a moment she wasn't Captain Murrin of Delta Airlines. She was Anthem, and she was bringing her people home. The F-22 on her left wing dipped slightly in a gesture of acknowledgement, pilot to pilot, warrior to warrior, and she felt something fierce and bright burn through her chest. Recognition, respect, the knowledge that whatever happened in the next few minutes she wasn't facing it alone. They were with her, these strangers in fighter jets, these inheritors of the traditions she'd helped build, and they would not abandon her to the darkness. 5 miles to the runway. descending through 8,000 feet. The landing gear warning horn sounded because she wasn't on glide path according to instruments that were lying. She ignored it, trusting her eyes instead, watching the runway lights expand and separate as she got closer. The visual approach was good, the angle looked right, and her airspeed by feel was probably around 220 knots, fast for this stage but manageable. "Gear down," she commanded. Kale reached for the gear lever and pulled. The familiar thunk of hydraulics, the grinding of massive wheels extending into the slipstream. 3 green lights confirmed the gear was down and locked, one of the few systems that was still working reliably. At least she wouldn't have to land this beast on its belly. "Flaps 5, she called next, beginning the sequence that would configure the aircraft for landing. The flaps extended with their characteristic whine, changing the wing's geometry, increasing lift and drag. The aircraft settled into its approach attitude, nose slightly high, sinking steadily toward the runway that was now close enough to see the concrete texture. Viper 11's voice, "Anthem, you're looking good on glide path 3 miles. 3 miles. 2 minutes. 120 seconds between here and there, between flying and landed, between alive and something else. She'd flown combat missions that lasted 6 hours and felt shorter than this endless descent through darkness toward a runway she could barely see. The jamming intensified suddenly, a wall of electronic noise that killed her radio mid-transmission and sent every instrument on the panel spinning wildly. Total chaos. Complete sensory denial. The kind of comprehensive electronic attack that should have been impossible against a civilian aircraft, but was happening anyway. She was flying the most sophisticated airliner in the world, and she might as well have been piloting a Cessna from 1950 for all the help the computers were providing. But she didn't need computers. She needed her eyes and her hands and the fundamental understanding of how aircraft behaved in 3-dimensional space. She needed the training that had been beaten into her through 10,000 hours of flight time and 3 tours of combat and every emergency procedure she'd ever practiced. She needed to be better than the technology trying to kill her. 2 miles. The runway was directly ahead now, the lights forming a perfect path through the darkness. She adjusted power, feeling the engines respond, watching the sink rate increase as she descended through 5,000 feet. Too fast. She pulled back slightly on the yoke, bleeding off some of the descent rate, searching for that perfect balance between gliding and falling. Kale was reading numbers from the backup altimeter, one of the few instruments still providing reliable data. 4,000, 3,500, sink rate 1,500 feet per minute. 1,500 feet per minute was too much for a normal approach, but this wasn't normal and she'd accepted that. She'd land hot and fast if necessary, use every foot of Edwards' mile-long runways, and deal with blown tires and smoking brakes later. The only thing that mattered was getting the wheels on the ground while everyone was still alive. 1 mile. She could see the threshold markers now, the white stripes that marked the beginning of the landing zone. Her hands moved across the controls with the precision of long practice, making tiny adjustments that kept them on the invisible glide path she was flying through pure instinct. The F-22s had peeled off, giving her room to land, but she could hear them overhead, still present, still protecting. 500 feet, Kale called. 400, 300. The ground effect cushioned them, that strange phenomenon where the air compressed between wings and earth, giving her just a bit more lift. She used it, holding the nose up, bleeding off airspeed, searching for that perfect moment when rubber would meet concrete and they'd transition from flight to ground. 100 feet, 50. The runway lights blurred past. She could see the tire marks from 1,000 previous landings, the weathered concrete, the edge lights marking the boundaries. Everything was happening in slow motion and at light speed simultaneously. 30 feet, 20. She pulled back on the yoke, flaring the aircraft, raising the nose to kill the descent rate. The main wheels touched first with a screech that was the most beautiful sound she'd ever heard. Touchdown. Solid ground. Reality. She let the nose wheel settle gently, then reached for the spoilers, deploying them to kill any remaining lift, transforming the wings from flying surfaces to barn doors. "Thrust reversers," she commanded, and Kale pulled the levers that redirected the engine thrust forward, helping them slow down. The aircraft shuddered as the reversers deployed, and she felt the deceleration pressing her against her seat harness. They were still doing 140 knots, still screaming down the runway too fast, but they were on the ground and slowing, and she had 2 miles of concrete ahead to work with. She stood on the brakes, feeling the massive carbon discs bite, converting kinetic energy to heat, bleeding off speed in a controlled burn. 80 knots. 60. 40. The end of the runway was getting closer, but they were slowing fast now, the immediate danger passing, the crisis resolving into something manageable. 20 knots. 10. 5. She brought the 777 to a complete stop with a quarter-mile of runway remaining, shut down the engines, and set the parking brake with hands that were shaking so badly she could barely grip the handle. "We're down," Cale whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Holy God, we're down." Rivka sat back in her seat and let herself breathe for the first time in 20 minutes. Behind them in the cabin, she could hear applause, passengers celebrating a landing they didn't understand had been anything but routine. Marcus would be making announcements, keeping things calm, maintaining the illusion that this had all been normal and boring. Through the cockpit window, she could see emergency vehicles approaching, fire trucks and ambulances forming a perimeter around the aircraft. Protocol for any emergency landing, but especially for one like this. They'd evacuate the passengers, inspect the aircraft, begin the investigation into what had happened and why. But before any of that could begin, she saw something that made her throat tight. The 4 F-22 Raptors were making a low pass over the runway, close enough that she could see every detail of their design, the angular stealth geometry, the weapons still visible on their pylons. They were flying in diamond formation, perfect and precise, and as they passed directly overhead they broke formation in a move she recognized from 100 military funerals. The missing man formation. One aircraft pulling up and away while the others continued straight and level, leaving a gap in the diamond where a pilot used to be. It was the highest honor one aviator could give another, a gesture reserved for fallen warriors and legends who'd earned their place in history. They were honoring her. Anthem. The call sign she'd thought she'd left behind 7 years ago along with her combat career and her belief that she'd mattered. These 4 pilots, strangers who knew her only by reputation and a few desperate radio calls, were breaking formation to acknowledge what she'd just done. They were telling her she was still one of them, still a warrior, still worthy of the traditions and the brotherhood that transcended branches and generations. Cale was watching too, and when he spoke his voice carried wonder. "They're saluting you. I've never seen that done for a civilian pilot." Rivka couldn't speak, because if she tried the words would come out broken. She just watched as the 3 remaining F-22s continued their pass, and the 4th climbed toward the stars, pulling vertical until it was just a point of light against the darkness, then rolling over and disappearing into the night. When they were gone, when the sky was empty again, she unstrapped from her seat and stood on legs that felt like water. The cockpit door opened and Marcus was there, his professional composure cracked, tears on his face. "Captain, I don't know what you did, but every person on this aircraft owes you their life." She shook her head because that wasn't quite right. "We all did our jobs. You kept the passengers calm. Cale flew instruments. The Air Force kept us safe. It was a team effort." But even as she said it, she knew it was more than that. It was a validation of every choice she'd made, every sacrifice she'd accepted, every night she'd missed tucking her daughter into bed because she was deployed to some desert keeping people she'd never meet safe from threats they'd never know about. It was proof that the years hadn't been wasted, that the skills hadn't atrophied, that Captain Rivka Murren still knew how to be Anthem when it mattered most. The airport authorities wanted statements. The FAA wanted data. The FBI wanted to know about electronic warfare attacks on civilian aircraft. But all of that could wait because right now she needed to call her daughter and hear her voice and remember why any of this mattered in the first place. She found a quiet corner while the passengers were being evacuated, while investigators swarmed the aircraft, while the world slowly returned to normal around her. She pulled out her phone, dialed the number she knew by heart, and waited through 2 rings before a sleepy voice answered. "Mom, it's like 3 in the morning." Rivka closed her eyes and smiled. "I know, sweetheart, I just wanted to hear your voice, tell you I love you." "Love you too, Mom, you okay? You sound weird." "I'm perfect. Go back to sleep. I'll call you tomorrow and we'll talk about your birthday." She hung up before her daughter could ask more questions, before she had to explain things that would only cause worry. Some stories were better left untold, some nights better left mysterious, some close calls better kept private. But as she stood there in the darkness of Edwards Air Force Base, watching her aircraft being towed away for inspection, she knew this story wouldn't stay quiet for long. Someone had tried to turn her plane into a weapon or a tragedy, and they'd failed because she'd been better than their technology and tougher than their plan. That would have consequences. Investigations. Headlines. Questions she'd have to answer about decisions she'd made in seconds with lives hanging in the balance. The Air Force would want to debrief her. The FAA would want to understand the electronic attack. The airline would want to know if she'd followed proper procedures. And through all of it, she'd have to relive those 20 minutes when she'd been responsible for 189 souls and 4 seconds that shouldn't have been possible. But that was tomorrow's problem. Tonight, she was just grateful to be standing on solid ground, breathing cool desert air, watching stars that looked exactly the same as they had when she'd last landed at Edwards 7 years ago in an A-10 that had taken so much damage the mechanics had wanted to scrap it. She'd refused to let them, insisted the aircraft deserved to be repaired and returned to service, and they'd honored her request. That warthog was still flying somewhere, still carrying pilots into harm's way, still doing the job it had been designed for. Maybe she was like that warthog, damaged but not broken, retired from combat but not from service. Different than she'd been, carrying scars that would never completely heal, but still capable of things that mattered when the situation demanded it. A black SUV pulled up, and a man in an Air Force uniform stepped out. Colonel's eagles on his shoulders, command pilot wings above his pocket. He walked toward her with the bearing of someone who'd spent decades in cockpits, and when he got close enough, she could see recognition in his eyes. "Captain Murrin, I'm Colonel Thane Vashon, wing commander here at Edwards. Hell of a landing. We've been monitoring the situation since your instruments went dark. I need to debrief you about what happened up there." Rivka straightened, feeling the weight of command expectations settling over her shoulders. "Yes, sir. Happy to provide whatever information you need." He studied her for a long moment, then smiled slightly. "You know, I was at Bagram in 2017. I was leading a strike package that got jumped by MANPADS on the way out. My wingman took a hit and his hydraulics were failing. You were the Sandy pilot who came screaming in at 200 feet, guns blazing, keeping the enemy suppressed while we got clear. You saved 4 aircraft and 12 pilots that day. I've been wanting to thank you for 8 years." The memory came back sharp and immediate. That mission had been chaos, surface-to-air missiles coming up like fireworks, radio traffic overlapping, aircraft damaged and limping home. She'd gone in low and slow in her A-10, using its titanium bathtub and redundant systems to absorb ground fire while friendlies escaped. It had earned her one of those distinguished flying crosses, and she'd never thought much about it beyond doing her job. "I was just doing what Sandy pilots do, sir, keeping the shooters' heads down." "You were doing a lot more than that, and tonight you did it again. Brought everyone home against impossible odds. That's what Anthem means. That's why that call sign matters." He paused, then added quietly, "We need pilots like you. Have you ever considered coming back? The Air Force would waive the medical discharge if you wanted to return to service. The offer hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Return to uniform. Return to combat. Return to the life she'd left behind when the doctors had told her she was too broken to be trusted with weapons and warfare. Part of her wanted it with an intensity that was almost painful, wanted to trade the airline uniform for flight suits, wanted to be back in a ready room surrounded by people who understood what she was. But she thought about her daughter, about the video calls and birthday parties and school events she'd miss if she deployed again. Thought about the nights she'd lie awake wondering if this mission would be her last. Thought about the weight of command and combat and the constant pressure of being responsible for lives in the worst possible circumstances. I appreciate the offer, sir, but I've got a daughter who needs me home, and I think I've had enough excitement for one lifetime. Colonel Vachon nodded, unsurprised. I understand, but the offer stands if you change your mind. In the meantime, I need you to walk me through everything that happened from the moment your instruments failed. We've got people from Cyber Command flying in, NSA wants a briefing, and the Pentagon is treating this as a potential national security threat. Someone tried to turn your aircraft into a weapon, and we need to know who and why. They walked toward the operations building together, and Rivka began the process of turning experience into information, translating those desperate minutes into the dry language of official reports. But even as she talked, part of her mind was still in that cockpit, still feeling the yoke in her hands, still watching the F-22s break formation in her honor. She'd been a warrior once, and tonight she'd proven she could still be one when needed. That knowledge was going to have to be enough, because she'd made her choice and she'd live with it. But God, it felt good to know she still had it, that the years hadn't stolen what made her special, that Anthem was more than just a memory from a younger, different version of herself. The investigation would take weeks. The FAA would examine every component, every circuit, every piece of code that might have contributed to the instrument failure. The FBI would track down the source of the electronic warfare attack, following digital breadcrumbs across continents. And somewhere in a classified facility, analysts would try to understand who would want to turn a commercial airliner into a target and what they hoped to accomplish by doing it. But Rivka Murrin would go back to flying her routes, back to explaining turbulence and making passenger announcements, back to the ordinary job that paid her bills and kept her daughter in good schools. She'd carry this night with her like she carried all the other nights, folded into memory, available when needed but not defining her every moment. The only difference was that now, somewhere in the Air Force's classified databases, her file would be updated. Medical discharge status unchanged, but with a note that Captain Rivka Anthem Murrin had demonstrated under extreme circumstances that she retained exceptional piloting skills and crisis management ability. That if the nation ever needed her again, if the situation ever became dire enough, she could be recalled to service. She didn't know it yet, but that note would matter. 6 months from now, when the investigation traced the electronic warfare attack to a sophisticated terrorist cell with capabilities that threatened every aircraft in American airspace, when conventional responses proved inadequate and creative solutions became necessary, someone would remember the pilot who'd saved 189 passengers with nothing but skill and courage. They'd remember Anthem, and they'd come asking if she had one more mission in her. But that was 6 months away, and tonight she just needed to finish her debrief, file her report, and find a hotel room where she could sleep for 16 hours straight and try to forget the sound of fighter jets breaking formation in her honor. Colonel Vachon led her into an office where computers were already running, where maps showed her flight path and anomalies, where serious people in military uniforms were assembling the pieces of what had happened. She sat down, accepted a cup of coffee that she didn't want but needed, and began telling her story from the beginning. It took 4 hours. They asked questions that seemed irrelevant but weren't, details about timing and sequence and decisions made in fractions of seconds. They wanted to know everything about the F-22 intercept, about the radio communications, about how she'd navigated without instruments. They recorded everything, backed it up in triplicate, treated it like the intelligence asset it was. When they were finally done, when she'd answered every question and provided every detail she could remember, Colonel Vashon walked her out to a waiting car. Dawn was breaking over the desert, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. "There's a hotel room reserved for you at the gateway. Sleep as long as you need. Your airline has been notified that you're grounded pending medical evaluation, standard protocol for any emergency landing. Take a few days. Process what happened. Then we'll need you back here for additional debriefings." Rivka nodded, too exhausted to argue, too numb to feel anything beyond bone-deep weariness. The car drove her through empty streets to a hotel that looked exactly like every other hotel she'd stayed in during 20 years of aviation. Generic comfort, reliable blandness, a room that could have been anywhere. She collapsed on the bed without bothering to undress, closed her eyes, and fell into sleep so deep it felt like drowning. No dreams, no nightmares, just darkness and rest and the temporary absence of thought. When she woke 12 hours later, the sun was setting again, and her phone showed 47 missed calls. News media, her airline, fellow pilots, even a few old squadron mates who'd somehow heard what happened and wanted to check on her. She ignored all of it, ordered room service, and sat by the window watching the desert turn purple in the fading light. Her daughter called while she was eating, full of questions because somehow the story had leaked. Social media was calling her a hero. Aviation forums were analyzing her landing. Someone had even posted video from the ground showing the F-22s breaking formation, and it was going viral with hashtags she didn't understand. "Mom, did you really fly blind? Did fighter jets really salute you? The internet is saying you saved almost 200 people." Rivka closed her eyes and tried